We're here at the Quilchena Golf Course, and today we're having a discussion with all BC's parties discussing the referendum vote, which is coming up very soon. Now, most of you watching have probably received your ballots. Some of you are confused. We've talked to a lot of people on the street, and we've got a lot of questions we're going to ask. We're going to keep them very, as I've said to everybody today, very man and woman on the street. We want simple answers. We're giving simple questions. We're asking your questions because you need answers to those questions. Okay, to my right is the Richmond Sentinel's editor, Martin Van den Hemel. Of course, you're putting this on again. How are you?
Fantastic.
Any thoughts as we go into this today?
Wow, it was fascinating. We talked to people on the streets, and the input they had was amazing. A lot of people said that they were very engaged, were studying before they wanted to vote. So looks like today there's an opportunity to educate them. That's for sure.
I think so. I talked to a lot of people, the burbs, I talked to people downtown. A lot of people seem confused, but as you said, doing your research, it's your duty to do this. That's what we're going to do here today. So as we said, we're going to talk to all three parties, and I'm going to talk to you after our first segment. I'll be back with you, Martin. Thank you. Okay, follow me over here right now. We're going to sit down and talk to the folks from the Liberal Party. They're up first, and I'm going to move my chair back to make sure we have everybody on camera. I hope everybody can be seen. Thank you. Okay, we've got a good group of people here today. Faces I'm sure you recognize. We've got Andrew Wilkinson, who's the leader of the official opposition party, of course, the Liberal Party. With us today is also Linda Reid, MLA for Richmond South Centre, John Yap from Richmond Steveston, Teresa Watt from Richmond North Centre, and Jazz Johal from Richmond Queensborough. Okay, Andrew, we're going to start with you, and then we'll open it up to everybody else here. Watching the debate the other night, and I've talked to my friends, and we don't often always agree politically, but one thing we all agreed upon was that you're both very passionate about your sides, you and the Premier, but that we got lost in the discussion and people talking over everybody. Today, we're just going to keep it very polite. We're having coffee, talking. Let's start by talking about your feelings on this upcoming vote.
Well, thanks for having us all, and great to be here. I think the concern we have is that this referendum is about voting rights. It's about something very fundamental in our democracy. Those voting rights belong to the voters. They don't belong to political parties. And what we've seen, unfortunately, in this referendum is that John Horgan and the NDP have basically taken it upon themselves to control the process. Part of that is we have a very confusing ballot that's come up to people. They get this thing in the mail, they're probably paying a bit of attention, they know it's coming. Once they get it, they read through it, and they're more confused than ever. And so what we tried to do in the debate was answer some very basic questions, such as how many MLAs would you have under this new system? How big would the ridings be under the new system? And it's something as simple as how many votes will you have? 2, 3, 4, 5 votes? That's pretty basic for people to make up their minds. And unfortunately, Premier Horgan wouldn't answer any of those questions.
That was a point in the discussion the other night that you had where you pressed a couple of times and didn't get the answer, at least that I wanted to hear. Let's get to some of the questions. As you said, we've kind of taken a poll of people on the street. Everybody is very engaged, but I think the commonality is this confusion on this. So these are some of the questions we want to know. And Andrew, I'll stick with you for a few minutes here. There are 3 options on the referendum ballot. Is it true that 2 of the 3 options on the ballot have never been used before?
That's correct. One of them, called MMP, is used in 4 countries around the world, including the poorest country in South America and a tiny country in Africa. And the other 2 options have never been used anywhere in the world. And so you have to ask, why is that? Because there are more than a dozen different options that are available around the world, and the NDP suddenly chose these 3, and it makes you wonder why they chose them, which adds to people's sense of uncertainty about this thing. You can't blame people for being unsure about this ballot because it's quite confusing. And so we're suggesting to people, if they want to have this done properly, to have citizens engaged in developing a question about changing the electoral system, they can safely choose to vote for line 1, which is to keep the current system, and then they'll get a proper citizens' assembly in a few years where a simple yes-no question would come up, and that would go on the ballot at the next general election.
Can you talk a little bit more? You alluded to the process of putting the 3 options together. Can you talk a bit about how that did come together?
Well, this is another unfortunate point in that the NDP said that when they cut their deal with the Green Party to form government in the summer of 2017, one of the conditions from the Green Party was to hold a referendum. And that's unfortunate because this is really being driven by the needs of political parties, not by the needs of voters and citizens. We had 2 referendums before, in 2005 and 2009. Both times the citizens of BC at a general election voted not to change the system. And now, because of the need to keep the Green Party happy, the NDP have put this referendum forward. So that's where we find ourselves. It's been set up with very minimal public involvement. The NDP chose the options, the NDP wrote the ballot, and we're asked to make our decision on that basis.
Okay, another question we received is it true that 60% of the MLAs will be voted in and 40% will be appointed from a candidate list privately set by the party in power?
Well, this is actually a small part of a bigger question, because if you look at all these options on the ballot, which we have here in front of us, there are 23 or more different features of these systems that haven't been disclosed. The NDP know what the answers are that they want, and they can get it afterwards, but they won't tell you what those options are. So we've been saying to people, this is a bit like going to the car dealership and saying, I want to buy a car. And the dealer, John Horgan, says, well, I'm not going to tell you whether it's diesel, gas, electric. I won't tell you how many doors it's got. I won't even tell you the color. Just sign here and you'll get a car, and he's going to choose the car. So this is a problem, because there are many, many features that are just simply unknown about this. And we're suggesting people make the straightforward choice of sticking with the current system. On line 1 of the ballot, it says, do you want to keep the current system known as first past the post? We suggest if people fill that out, and only that line, then they can move ahead with some assurance that this is going to be an orderly process, not something that's been set up for to keep the Green Party happy.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one last question, then we'll open up to the rest of your colleagues here. One of the questions people asked me a lot was, will proportional representation system cost the government more money?
Well, this referendum is costing about $15 million, and that's a very good reason why it should have been done at the same time as a general election, where it would have been free. It also would have been much cleaner at a general election, because there's no need to mail stuff out to people. They would have all gone to vote at the ballot box anyway. And then there's this question of, if you do change to a proportional representation system, you get lots of little parties that proliferate. That's how it works everywhere in the world where it's been used, and they each have their own spending expectations. So you can bet your bottom dollar that your taxes are going to go up and government spending will go up, because the idea is to keep those small parties happy, to keep them in a coalition. Okay.
Well, we should remind people, and we will continue to do this throughout the day. If you're watching and want more information, it's elections.bc.ca. You can also call 1-800-661-8683, 1-800-661-8683, elections.bc.ca. Okay, as we mentioned earlier, along with Andrew today is Linda, John, Teresa, and Jazz. Guys, I'd like to open up and get your thoughts. We'll work our way around the table. It's the easiest way to do this. Linda, let's start with you.
Well, when my constituents come to talk to me.
Oh, you know what, hang on, we're doing live stream. You gotta have a microphone. This is not mine. Here you go, Linda, my apologies.
Come to talk to me. We basically have a conversation about there's 2 types of voting. There's the one where you mark the ballot. You get to choose the name you're going to put your mark by. Or there's types of voting where the party marks the ballot. And I've spent my career, all my life, worried about how we get more women involved in politics. The notion that we're going to take what has now become a front-room exercise, where women seek the nomination in a transparent, open way, and put that in the back room and decide whether or not a woman's name gets chosen off a list, any candidate's name gets chosen off a list. It's hugely problematic for me. I see that as a step backwards. And if you take the 4 of us here, who's running for election, who gets appointed to election, at the end of the day, how accountable will anyone be to the voter if that person doesn't have any kind of trust relationship? There's been no discussion at all about whether or not this person selected or appointed into a particular riding will actually reside in that riding, will actually come from the area. That's hugely important to me. Local representation is hugely important to me.
Yeah, because I think that one of the questions, I remember one of the questions was about, okay, if I know that you're my MLA, or I don't know who my MLA is in the region, if people are getting appointed, I don't know, who do I go see? Do I come see you? Do I go see, so are you finding people are asking that a lot?
Yeah. And we don't know the answers either, and the leader is absolutely correct that the New Democrats haven't said a single word about what happens the day after. Should this pass, I think it's hugely problematic in terms of local representation, direct access from your MLA, and direct accountability to your MLA. I think those things need to be the foundation stones for how we go forward.
Excellent. Jazz, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, my experience, and I look back to my experience as a journalist, having covered many communities throughout BC, but globally as well. And for me, the number one word that's very important for me is stability. We have built one of the greatest economies in the world. We have one of the best healthcare systems in the world, best education, advanced education, primary education, and a standard of living. That doesn't happen by accident for a province that has a very diverse geography and diverse people. And we've done that with first past the post. So if you look at British Columbia on its own and compare that to jurisdictions around the world, 195 countries globally, what are we lacking? And at the end of the day, yes, we can make education a little bit better, healthcare could be improved, and that's something that we continue to work on. But the basic electoral system that allows accountability, that has allowed us to build this great province and continues to grow. So who are we doing this for? The problem I find with proportional representation is you get very much small extreme parties. It could be along linguistic lines, racial lines, religious lines, whatever it may be, that those parties benefit when they remain strident. The present system forces us to be to have basically broad parties. Within our caucus, we will have disagreements, but we will come to agreement, coalesce around broad ideas, because we're a broad province, but we're a large province of a diverse population. So the present system forces diverse parties to have big tent parties, to listen to different views within your caucus. And then we've been able to build this great society because of it. You bring in proportional representation, you're going to get extremist parties who benefit by sticking to a very narrow view of the world and not saying, you know, I'm going to compromise here because for the greater good. And so that's the challenge that I find that we're going to be under. Don't worry about whether this is a three-party system right now. Under proportional representation, I can guarantee you we'll have 4, 5, 6, 7 parties coming forward. So how are you ever going to get things done? Right? Government costs more too under.
I was going to say, one of the things I did hear, and I've been reading a lot about too, is that countries doing this, it seems to take a lot more time to put the government in place.
Yeah, in some cases, it's 500 days we've seen in some European countries. So that's a challenge as well. I just think the system in this province works. In this case, we're bringing this forward. Why? Because the Green Party has demanded it from the NDP. This is to placate a 3-person party. It's not because the NDP is demanding it. It's to placate the leader of the Green Party. And this is going to go on and on and on. And as Andrew has said, it's costing us $15 million to placate a 3-person party. That $15 million can pay for probably almost 5 or 6 hours of health care in this province. Yeah, right? And that's what we're talking about here.
Okay. John, we're going to hand things over to you. John Yap, your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Jim, and it's great to be here. Thanks to the Sentinel for this opportunity. Probably the number one issue that I hear from constituents who come in and talk to us about this is the potential, if we go to Prop Rep, to losing the local connection, the local accountability. That's the number one issue for constituents, that they want to feel that their MLA that is representing them is someone that is from the community or is part of the community, and when time for the election is someone that they have a chance to vote for or not vote for. So that's probably the number one, that is the number one concern that constituents have. And, you know, Linda and Jazz have covered some of the really critical points. The one I think we've all heard about, which I think is worth emphasizing, is this is such a rushed and poorly put together process, which really should not have been in the hands of politicians, you know, on either side. It should have been done in a nonpartisan way, as was done in 2005 and 2009, where it was handled through a citizens' assembly that put together ordinary citizens with no political axe to grind to brainstorm about how do we potentially reform our electoral system. And they did that, and they came up with a suggestion. We had 2 referendum, and both did not succeed. Now, here's one of the things that's not in place now, which was the case back in 2005 and 2009. We had some reasonable thresholds. So the current referendum has no participation threshold. So right now we're seeing about 5% of British Columbians return their ballots. Yeah. And there's no minimum requirement. So if we end up on November 30th that only, say, 10 or 12% or 15% of British Columbians mail in their ballots, this thing could be decided by a very small percentage, which only requires 50% plus 1 to pass.
And it's should we clarify too? It's 50% plus 1 of the ballots
mailed in.
Mailed in.
Yes.
So you even minimize more.
Sure. Okay. I mean, there's almost 4.9 million British Columbians. There's about 3.5 million voters in that range. And if it happens that at the end of November, Elections BC only receives 10% of the ballots back, and 50% plus one of the ballots returned decide for PR, that could be the consequence of this process that's being put in place. There was no minimum threshold for participation. There was no minimum for at least showing a reasonable majority of British Columbians. In past referendum, it was 60%. Right. You needed 60% threshold to pass. You also needed 60% of the ridings around the province. So that ensured some fairness about representation, so that this thing couldn't be decided by a few ridings within the Lower Mainland turning in their ballots. So we've said from day one, and we'll continue to say, that this process has been botched, and that the only approach is to say, keep our current system, and as Andrew has said, if we're ever going to have a opportunity to look at reforming our system, it should be done in a nonpartisan way with a citizen assembly and keep politics out of it. And unfortunately, that's not the case now.
Okay. Teresa, we'll go to you last here.
Thank you, Jim. First of all, I'd like to thank the Sentinel for giving us this opportunity to talk about the pros and cons of a proportional representation. I think this is exactly the kind of opportunity this NDP government should have given to British Columbia so that we can have more debate, more information session, but instead it's such a rush process that we don't really have much time to really convey, to communicate to British Columbians about the free proportional representation option, because right now the government hasn't really given any information. As our leader already said, there are 23 factors that are not known. You don't know how many MLAs there will be under proportional representation, and you don't know how many MLA that will represent your riding. For example, in our Richmond municipality, right now we have 4 ridings, that if any of the PR is implemented, we might incorporate into 1 riding. Even worse still.
I was going to ask, would it be, I assume it would be 2. If that way, would it, you don't
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. They refuse to answer our question. And I think one other point we should note is all the current and the late NDP premiers, they all say no to British Columbia, including Glenn Clark. Glenn Clark said that under any of the PR, there will be no local representation. There will be no local accountability. And Wujo Dosanjh said that they will be giving rise to extremist party, and he's really worried because he is the victim of the extremists. And the late Dave Barrett said no to proportional representation. I remember Mike Harcourt also said no in 2009 during our referendum. So you will ask, why are all the NDP premiers saying no except John Horgan? So obviously, this is a secret deal, not a secret deal, it's an open deal between NDP and the Green Party because they want to hold on to power. And John Horgan has to give in to Andrew Weaver, or else he will topple him and it will trigger another election. So this is their ambition to hold on to power, and this is not fair to British Columbia because we are not being given clear information. Let's talk about my own riding. I represent Richmond North Centre. And over 50% of my constituents are immigrants from Asia. And they have been talking to me that they received this ballot package. And it's so confusing. And in the last 2 times, in 2005, 2009, we just give them a simple yes and no answer. And now you are given 2 parts of the question. They can't even know what the 3 options are. I don't think it's fair. And they all come to ask me, how am I going to fill up this ballot? This is not unfair because we have not been even given any kind of information session. Just ask them to go to Election BC website. That's not clear, even on Election BC website, because the government hasn't given information to Election BC to state clearly what the 3 options are. So I think it's definitely not fair. We are not saying that first past the vote is the perfect system. As Winston Churchill said, is the best one given that there are no better option. But if we want to change the system, we got to give British Columbia more information so that they can make an informed decision.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, I want to come back to you on this. Your colleagues have alluded to this a couple of times in terms of previous referendums. A lot of people don't have long memories when it comes to what's been going on in the last 15 years. That's fine. People got busy lives. But can you just explain to our viewers what was the pitch then in 05 and 09, I believe, and what went wrong and what were the pitfalls? Give people a background on the previous
there were two unusual elections in 1996 and 2001. The first one in 1996, the Liberal Party had many thousands more votes than the NDP, but the NDP won more seats. And then in 2001, people might remember that there was a huge wave of support for the BC Liberals.
Andrew, sorry to cut you off. Won't cut you off again.
The Liberals won 77 seats to 2. And so with those two unusual elections, people thought, well, maybe it's time to have another look at our voting system. So in 2004, Gordon Campbell put together this Citizens' Assembly, which was done by selecting people at random from all around British Columbia. And it's very important to remember, in that process, the political parties themselves were told to stay completely out of it. They were 1,000 kilometers away from this process. What happened over a period of a year, that group of citizens with the right academic support, with the right funding, came up with a simple yes-no question. And it was, do you favor changing to what was called STV, a particular voting system? That was put on the general election ballot in 2005, and it was defeated. It was put on the ballot again in 2009, and it was thoroughly defeated by about 61 to 39% of the population. So people thought, well, we've had enough of that now, and no need to revisit that for the near future. And then along came this deal between the Green Party and the NDP last summer, and the Green Party initially said they wanted it just to be a vote in the legislature to force us all to accept their new voting system. And the answer to that was forget it. So what we've got instead is this mail-in ballot that we've all seen in the mail that is very confusing, and we think it's a totally inappropriate way to go about it. It really should have been kept in the hands of citizens, because you, the citizens of British Columbia, are the ones who should own and operate the voting system. It shouldn't be toyed with and monkeyed with by political parties. That's exactly what's going on right now.
Andrew, one of the questions that someone posed to me is they said, look, I don't want to sound simple, but I really thought that the ballot would be just yes or no, just check. And they get it, and Teresa, I believe you alluded to the fact that you look and oh, there's a whole bunch of other things. Can you walk everybody through the next question, which was explain all the options that are on that?
Exactly.
First, the one we've been doing now, and three ones being proposed.
Well, there's a very short answer to this and a very long answer. We've got the ballot here in front of us, and the first question says, do you favor keeping the current system known as first past the post? And you can fill in the circle there. In fact, that's what we suggest you do, and then you're done. Because that's sending a clear message to the NDP and the Greens that don't play games with this voting system, because this is a very confusing ballot. If you fill it in that way, we keep our current system for the near future, and we've suggested there should be another look at whether we change this, but done in a way that's not being toyed with by political parties. That's done entirely by the citizens of BC. So that's the way in which you guarantee yourselves an orderly future, a way in which our electoral system will be protected, and you can decide whether to change it, not the political parties. Unfortunately, the rest of the ballot says, do you favor changing to proportional representation? If you fill in that, then you're supposed to fill in the little table underneath, which is like a crossword puzzle, and you have to choose between three options. And they are DMP, RUP, and MMP, and I have yet to find anybody in the province of British Columbia who can explain the whole thing to me. Those involve voting multiple times, and they won't tell us how many times, as many as 5 or 6 times on a ballot, and then your votes are transferred around the province. And this is a key question that I asked John Horgan in the debate last Thursday, and he refused to answer it. How are those votes moved around BC? Are all of my votes moved around, or just the second or third or fourth or fifth vote? It's very confusing, and they're not providing any answers. So we suggest to people, you can vote to keep the current system by simply filling out the first line of the referendum ballot, and then you're done. You can package it up, sign it the way you're supposed to, and send it in, and you'll be done.
Can we just off the road here for a second in terms of voting in general? One of the things I've seen, and we saw it in the States this past week with their midterms, is getting younger people to vote. I mean, I think it was all-time high in the American midterms, but it was still horrible. How are we going to reach the younger folks? Because we're talking more about, I'm on the further tail end than I am at the beginning. So we're talking about the millennials' futures. That is the market I think that needs to be targeted. And I'll open this up to everybody. How do we hit them? Is there something we could do better? Can we have online help? How do we get them interested? Because I said to you, I can see a 21, 22-year-old, if he does get the ballot, probably chucking or not interested. How do we engage them? We'll start with you.
This is very important because obviously the incoming young voters beyond the age of 18 are the future of the province. And it's interesting, in the U.S., a lot of people don't want to vote because if they get on the voters list in the U.S., they're subject to jury duty and they get called off their job and dragged in for lengthy trials.
Okay.
In Canada, that's not the case. So we encourage people to make sure they're registered to vote. If they didn't receive the ballot and they're Canadian citizens over 18, they should be in contact with Elections BC and make sure they get a ballot. And they can still do that. Now, in terms of youth involvement, our job as elected people is to make politics and the world we live in exciting for young people, to talk about those opportunities for all of BC so that young people get the sense that it matters. Right now, it may seem to them, well, it's not going to make any difference, they're not really following it, and they'll just leave it aside. We really encourage young people to get involved and to make informed decisions.
And are we putting a platform? I mean, like, I think doing something today, and Jazz, you've been in TV a long time, I've been doing TV a long time, the numbers are going down in terms of TV. Are you reaching out to other platforms, obviously this being one of them? So, I mean, where are the kids looking to get more information? Instagram, Twitter? Yeah,
totally.
Social media.
And, you know, the change away from the old world of newspapers, which is almost done, into the world of electronic communication. In the 50s, it was television, and nowadays it's social media. And so the unfortunate thing about social media that we all know is you get into a channel on social media and all you hear is your own views repeated. You don't get a broader view of the world. And so it's important for all of us to hold events like this, to offer ourselves up to the voters, no matter what age they are, so they can make their own decision, provide as much information as we can, and let voters make their minds up. And that should have been the way for how this whole thing was set up, but unfortunately it got taken over by the NDP. And we're now trying to send a clear message that these are voters' rights. These don't belong to a political party. We should respect the voters, stick with the current system, and then people will have their options fully available to them.
Just sticking with that point, and somebody else can answer, or Andrew, you answer. How do you deal with like kind of that low voter turnout?
Well, why don't we hand this over to the TV man, Mr. Jazz Johal. Here you go.
Well, I think that's a very complex question. If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be doing other things because it's an issue that plagues not only Canada but the United States and Western Europe as well. It's an ongoing issue. But, you know, we cannot forget the fact that about 38% of the Lower Mainland now is millennial. So those are people 36, 37 and under. That is a challenge. You saw in the last federal election a greater amount of millennials voting. You saw a greater amount of millennials and young people voting in the midterm elections. I think the highest numbers in almost 2 or 3 decades. So you're seeing pockets of real optimism there, and I think it's a question of the policies that all political parties bring forward in regards to really addressing some of these needs. In 9 out of 10 provinces today, Gen X and millennials, collectively those 52 and under, outnumber baby boomers. Baby boomers still play a significant role in this province and have a lot to offer. But policies to a certain degree have been baby boomer centric probably the last 2 decades because they have been the wider swath of the population. So there is a generational shift going on, not just in politics, but in the corporate world and in all jobs and professions out there. So it's our job now to recognize that. I think that conversation is now starting to permeate the conversation in politics in regards to how do we address those issues, like look at affordability, what are the jobs of the present and the future, particularly with technical disruption that's out there. So I think these are coming to the forefront anyway. And I think also, and I found this in television, is that once you get married, you have children, you have a mortgage, you have those daily needs and requirements of a job, commuting to work, all those issues that you've got to deal with. And when you start going through that, when you just sort of go through life, you get engaged into transportation issues, you get engaged into economic issues, you get engaged into daily politics. So that's part of that as well. And I think I look back to when I was in my early 20s to today, you're much more engaged now in the political process and in what's going on in life. But I think in this case, with the low voter turnout, as Andrew said, or John has said, at 5%, this isn't a millennial issue. It's also a Gen X issue, and it's a baby boomer issue. Yes. We're not engaging British Columbians. And I think part of the problem is that the process that the Premier and the Green Party set up. It's specifically set up to be manipulative. It's specifically set up to confuse people. It shouldn't be this difficult at the end of the day to decide what political system you support, 1, and 2, at the end of it, even if you did support Prop Rap, there are 29 outstanding issues that will be decided after you voted by the NDP cabinet. It's ridiculous. So to argue that this is just we're not reaching out to millennials, I don't think so at all. I think this is a failure to excite and at the end of the day engage British Columbians, and that falls at the feet of Mr. Horgan and to a certain degree Mr. Weaver and the Green Party.
I think that was what we started out with is all about these simplistic answers to just basic questions is what we want to get out. Again, you're both very passionate, sir, and I watched the whole debate the other night, but I was, you both want to get your points out, and just that people we're talking to on the streets have that comment about, I'm confused. Even if you do your research, there's, well, if you vote this, you get extremists coming up the ranks if you do. If you don't, you get extremists coming. It's very difficult to kind of work your way through the research on both sides that are reinforcing.
Yeah, and I understand where you're coming from there, but at the end of the day, with our present system, if you're not happy with what Jazz Joe Hall is doing, or any of these MLAs have done, they're accountable to you. You can go knock on their doors and say, look, I got an issue. Can you please deal with it? I don't care if you're a BC Liberal, a New Democrat in my riding, or a Green. I'm there to help you, number one. Number two, if I don't perform, then I'm accountable every 4 years, or you can vote me out. People understand that system. And like I said, it's worked for us for over 150 years. It's worked for over 300 years in the UK. So why are we messing with it? If there are tweaks that need to be made within the system, let's do it. And let's be honest, the BC Liberals, as Andrew has said and John has said, we introduced this a vote in 2005 and 2009. And the fundamental difference is, it had accountability and authenticity there. Why? Because we handed it over to the public. You decide what the question is. I remember as a journalist covering those conversations at the WAS Centre for Dialogue. It was everyday people from every riding getting together in Vancouver saying, what's wrong with the system? How do we want to fix it? Here's the question. And it's a simple yes and no question, number one. Number two, here's what's going to happen if this thing moves ahead, which means here's some maps. This is what your riding's going to look like after if you vote yes. So there is, at its core, honesty there. You don't have any of that there in this case. You have Mr. Horgan saying, look, if you vote for this, first of all, I'm not sure how to explain the system because it's too complicated for me. Hey, what do I know? I'm just the Premier. So Andrew got right to the point with him. The Premier of this province couldn't explain what we're expected to vote on, number one. And even if you do vote for Prop Rep, there's 29 outstanding issues, and don't worry, the NDP cabinet will handle that as well. So if you don't start with honesty and authenticity right from the start, what's the point? So that's what offends me as a voter.
Linda, you want to jump in?
I just want to come back to your point on millennial voters. I'm the mother this year of a millennial voter.
Okay, tell us.
And in probably about 6 to 8 months back, she got all her friends together and signed them all up because they were voting the first time ever in the municipal election. Hugely important, and the notion that they're all signed up now has frankly sparked their interest, so they continue to have dialogue conversation. She's now in first year at the University of Victoria, and she has a whole array of probably 100 guys all the time saying, what about this, what about that? So is there interest? Absolutely. Can they get the information they're looking for? In this instance, not. So they're frustrated. They're absolutely frustrated.
Does that turn to apathy? Then we're just, I can't.
Well, we can't let it slip away. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about John Horgan badly wrapping up a birthday gift for Andrew Weaver. And frankly, all of us collectively as British Columbians are paying for it. The notion that it's completely misunderstood in so many ways. And it's not a question of whether or not you want to see electoral reform. It's whether or not you want to see electoral reform done properly. I mean, even the fact that there's no threshold. I mean, you can't change a bylaw in a townhouse complex with less than 75% of the vote. And this has no threshold? I mean, the young people, my daughter and her friends, they are absolutely appalled that it's just a free-for-all. It's an absolute free-for-all. And they see stacks of them stacked up at the university, abandoned ballots. There's no security in terms of showing up at the ballot and having identification that describes yourself. There's just pick up 20 extra ballots and do what with it? I mean, all of it is just clumsy and awkward, not done particularly well. Kids have an exact sense of ethics and understanding and want it to be done well if it's going to be done at all. That's where they are today.
They seem to be the most, and they're probably watching because we're doing it on this forum, but they seem the most moralistic in terms of what they expect from something as simple as their brands. You know, a Nike ad being the most recent one where they do. It's just getting them to get engaged. And sorry, Tracy, you wanted to say?
Actually, it's an excellent question that you asked, Jim. That's why BC Liberal, well, our caucus and the whole party have been trying hard to reach out to all, especially millennials. And that's why in our recent convention, Andrew announced the new brand for BC Liberal. Our slogan is Opportunity for All of BC. Andrew wants to really provide opportunity to the millennials so that when when every young person that come home, they say, Mom, Dad, I got a job. That's what we are about, and that's how we are going to appeal to millennials. That's what I want to put across.
Okay, thank you. Edward, would you explain, I believe in the debate you mentioned that you're not against change, if it's done correctly, you said, but you talk a bit about citizens' assembly.
Sure. This was something that was done back in 2004, and the idea was to get people randomly chosen from around BC, and if you were chosen and couldn't do it, they would transfer that to someone else. But these were true average British Columbians who came in from all over the province, and then they got their say in what they were concerned about, and were asked to come up with a very straightforward yes-no question, and that's what happened in the 2005 election that was put on the ballot. So the beauty of that is it cost nothing to do the voting at the ballot because it was at the same time as a general election, and it was also maximum public interest, and importantly, it meant that there was no possibility of fraud because it's at an election. You have to show your face to the people who work for Elections BC. So that was the right way to do it. And the concern we have now is this is the wrong way to do it with incomplete information, a confusing ballot being mailed in to keep the Green Party happy. This is not the right way in which to go to the fundamentals of your democracy. And there's a real key concern we have that John Yap is probably going to elaborate on, that this effectively, what they're proposing, transfers power from the voter to the hands of the political parties. Because you're asked to pick a party, and then the party bosses choose the MLAs who don't have to come from anywhere near you. They could come from Kamloops or Campbell River and purport to represent Richmond. And it's going to encourage a lot of nepotism and insider behavior where people choose their friends to be MLAs. John?
I have been following social media quite closely, especially in this issue, and in recent days, that it's really ramped up on all sides. And one of the tweets that struck me yesterday was one that referred to if you go to Prop Rep, you're actually and allowing parties to pick MLAs. Those MLAs could be picked over and over and over again, and it's almost a form of tenure, for politicians. And I think, sure, in the academic system, the university system, we all accept that, yes, there is a place for the tenure system, but I don't think British Columbians would stand for moving to a system where political parties, through mechanisms that may not be transparent, that may be potentially corrupt, would entrench the selection of individuals that people really don't want to be the MLAs, but simply because they're members in good standing with a political party, so-called party hacks, insiders, loyalists, they get rewarded with positions. And they could be appointed to be in ridings anywhere in the province. And I think British Columbians, when they hear that, will reject that, because we are all and I hear this from constituents. We value this tradition that has been handed down to us over the last 100+ years of living in this democracy, which is you have a vote and you vote for the person that stands for election, and the candidate that has the most votes wins in that riding. And that's a direct connection, and I believe that's what people value. They cherish that, and they want to see that continue.
Well said. Okay, what we're going to do, and leading from that, we're going to wrap up soon. One of the things that we've been stressing today, and one of the impressions I got the last couple of days, or the rest of the people working on the crew, is just give me the basics. And so, Andrew, we'll start with you. 30 seconds. Tell that person on the street why they should say no.
Well, the concern about this referendum is that it's taking your rights as a voter and playing games with it. And there's a very clear way for you to say, I'm not interested in getting into all these specific details. I haven't been told the whole story. I'm confused by the whole process. You can send that message clearly on this referendum by simply filling in the first line on the ballot saying you want to keep the current system. And if we have anything to say with it, you'll get that citizens' assembly where you'll have a clear opportunity to express yourselves later on. The concern with this system is it's come around. Most people are pretty confused when they get the ballot. They feel like they're being imposed upon. They're not sure what to do with it. And that leads to low participation. Right now, we have less than 5% of people who voted. That's no way to change the electoral system. It's certainly no way to elect the government of a province to have 5% of people making a choice.
Okay, great. Tracy?
John Horgan asked the British Columbians to vote for proportional representation by leap of faith. As Warren Palmer said, this is a leap into darkness. So I'm hoping that British Columbia know that this is not a fair referendum. How can you have a leap into darkness, as Warren Palmer said? So vote yes to maintain the current first-past-the-post system and say no to proportional representation. Thank you.
So that darkness and that leap into the unknown is the lack of information, key details that the government, the NDP and the Greens are not providing us. They may know those details, but they're not providing us. So we are asking British Columbians, asking voters to vote to keep the current system, first past the post, and as been said, you only need to answer question 1, keep first past the post, and send in your ballot, in the envelopes as needed. It's important to vote, and we encourage people to do that. This right to vote is every British Columbian's right, and we encourage all British Columbians, all voters, to participate, to support first past the post, which has worked well for our province for over 100 years. And let's not muck it up by leaping into the unknown.
Okay, Jazz?
Yeah, I'm going to keep my comments very short. I think my colleagues have really nailed it on the head here. This has been rigged from day one. And what I am telling voters is what I've said at the beginning of this program, to look at British Columbia and the stability that we have. A great province, an affluent province, a just province with a great healthcare system and education system, great standard of living, which still is a beacon of light to people around the world. From all over the world, people want to move to British Columbia for a reason. We do things well here, and that's because of the first-past-the-post system. We've been able to provide for our citizens in the past century, and we are building a 21st century economy that I think is going to provide just as much in regards to resources and in regards to benefits. That happens because of what we've done with first-past-the-post. So I ask that my constituents and all Richmondites to please support the present system of first-past-the-post. Number 1, put it in with black ink and one and done. Mail it off, and I think that's the way to go.
Okay, and lastly, Linda.
I want to continue to live in a province and, frankly, in a country where I get to mark my ballot, where I get to put my mark against the name of the person I believe will best represent me. That's the crux of the issue for me. I don't want a political party, any political party, making that determination for me. I think it's about individual rights and freedoms, and I want to continue to exercise mine.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of the Richmond Sentinel, we want to thank you all for joining us here today. I hope that the viewers watching out there were able to get some education. We're talking to all the parties today. Liberal Party was first. We've been talking with Andrew Wilkinson, the party leader. We also had Linda Reid, John Yap, Tracy Watt, Jazz Johal, all Liberal candidates here with Andrew. And we're going to take a break. We're going to talk to Martin in just a few seconds. Again, thank you all for taking time today. It's a busy day, and we appreciate you being here in Richmond to talk to us, and we wish you luck going forward. Well, if you have any questions about what we're doing here today, some of the comments that have been made, you can always go to elections.bc.ca, or you can also call 1-800-661-8683. We should also mention, if you also go to elections.bc.ca/referendum, you can get more information. 14 different languages are available if you have questions. Hey, speaking of questions, we're going to go street level right now for a question on the street.
I do understand on the form that you can simply just vote for proportional representation. But I do want to know why you gave us 3 quite complicated choices, which I think are confusing people and distracting them from filling in the form.
Well, we're back here in Richmond at the Quilchena Golf Course. Lovely day here. It's part 2. If you missed the first part with the Liberal Party, the Government side is going to explain a whole bunch of things about that, where you can see it all. Next up is the Green Party. I am standing here with Martin Van Ham. He is the editor for the Richmond Sentinel, who is putting this on today. Martin, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you very much for hosting.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I'm finding this fascinating because I'm a moderator, but I'm also a voter who is at times been confused with all the rhetoric and all the talk that's out there and all the research you're doing. So let's talk a bit about the Sentinel, the involvement in the city, and then we'll get into where people can see this.
Yeah, so absolutely. So we've had the first round already. The Liberals came out for the first hour. And for those of you that missed that, that's available on the Richmond Sentinel's YouTube channel. Then we've got the next hour, we've got the Green Party here with us. Thank you very much for coming out. And if you miss it live, we'll be replaying that afterwards as well, and you can share it with everybody afterwards. And then finally, of course, we've got the NDP, and they'll be coming in as well.
That's great. And we should. Are you guys covering this print-wise and online-wise in the paper?
We haven't really. It's been kind of. It's something that we haven't been able to dedicate the resources to as much as we wanted to. So instead, what we've done is we provided this.
That's good in-depth coverage. Yeah, we get it right from the people that are on the front line. Okay, we're going to come back and talk to you at the end of the segment. Thank you, Martin. Moving back over to the table where we started out the show. And as Martin said, we're joined by members of the Green Party right now. I will introduce them. Guys, thank you for joining us on a busy weekday. Sat Harwood is the Chair, Provincial Council for the BC Green Party. We've got Nicholas Sperling, who is BC Green's spokesperson and appears on CBC Radio Early Edition. I'll have to talk to you about what it's like to get up very early. I've done that for a number of years in television. And also, we have an added guest here today, Peter Houseschmidt. Did I get the last name right? Peter Houseschmidt? Thank you, Peter. Green Party candidate, the last election, and spokesperson. Okay, guys. One of the things we kicked off in our first segment, as I said to you just before we kicked off this segment, is that we've done a lot of canvassing, talking to people on the street, getting their thoughts. And there is a couple things that really run as a through line through this. As people are getting their ballots, and again, if you don't get your ballot, we should mention to you that you can actually go to elections.bc.ca/referendum or simply call 1-800-661-8683. We'll give out that information a little later. Again, people are confused. You know, we watched the debate the other night. You take the time to watch the debate, and it was exasperating. As I said, you know, both gentlemen were very passionate about their point of views, but it was talking over each other. And I think people walked away still very confused. We're going to start with you. Can you talk about the debate, and again, what are you hearing from people when you go out and talk to them?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for having us today. And
You're
also,
welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you to the Richmond Sentinel for doing this. I think this is a great activity that you've put on for the voters. You know, in terms of impressions of the debate, I think I share the frustration that you've expressed and that many others have. You know, it was a debate where both sides were trying to win the debate rather than trying to spend that time explaining to voters the pros and cons of each system. So I think from an educational standpoint, there was certainly something lacking on both sides. You know, and I think in terms of that issue of people's perceived lack of understanding, you know, electoral systems are complex systems. That's the nature of the political process. Speaking from my own personal perspective, I've certainly had some time to read through the different electoral systems that are being proposed to voters. I think that when one bears down into the details of those systems, that in fact they are systems that, with some practice and understanding, are relatively easy to understand. But unfortunately, we live in a climate where those educational discussions are being lost in the competition for sound bites and airplay and sort of points of view. And so unfortunately, that has somewhat muddied the waters on the debate about the systems that we're looking at right now.
One of the things we all agreed about today when we were putting this together is Nicholas, I said to you, this is not going to be a CNN 2-minute soundbite. We're going to sit down and have a conversation like it's people over coffee and exchanging ideas, and that's what we want to do. So, okay, Sal, I'm going to stick with you for another question here. And the question I was asked by people, and when I said I was going to be sitting with all three party representatives, is, okay, I want to know more about why change, Sat? What do you say to those people?
Yeah, well, look, that's a very important question. I think fundamentally for the Green Party, in terms of where we come from, we approach this as really being a matter of fairness. You know, we live under a political system where you do not need to get even close to a majority of the votes in order to be elected into office. If you look, for example, in Richmond, and I was doing a bit of reading up on sort of the electoral results from the 2017 election. What you see, for example, in Richmond there's sort of 4 ridings that were part of the electoral process in the last election. In all 4 of those ridings, the Liberals were successful and gained 4 seats. If you look at the split of the popular support in Richmond, you know, if you look across those 4 ridings, the NDP had around 38-39% of the popular support in the 4 Richmond ridings. The Liberals were about 48-49%, and the Greens were around 12-13%, sort of ballpark in that area. But the Liberals came out with 100% of the seats. So over 50% of the residents of Richmond did not vote for a Liberal candidate, and yet they got all 4 of the seats in those ridings. So from a fairness standpoint, we look at that and go, you know, that's just not right. You know, the makeup of the legislature should reflect the voting sensibilities of the people of Richmond. And unfortunately, under the current system, it just doesn't do that.
Do you think, though, I mean, people are resistant, obviously, to change, and I'll throw this out to the rest of the panel here. You guys really, the NDP who are defending this, really have to, in my mind, almost go the extra yards because you have to, you're defending it as opposed to attacking it. Nicola, I'll throw this to you from your media standpoint. What are you hearing from people out there?
I'm hearing a lot of misinformation around the systems, a lot of a lack of information around the systems. So I think part of what our job here today is to explain what each system is really about and why proportional representation is a fair form of democracy. It, like Sat mentioned, it makes sure that the votes and the MLAs that are in the legislature reflect the way that the people in British Columbia have voted. So that, in essence, is going to provide us with a more democratic system. It's going to provide us with MLAs that are working on behalf of their constituents, and it's going to make sure that decisions that happen in the legislature are made based on consensus and based on collaboration at a government level.
Okay, and Peter, we'll go to you next. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, based on my experience in the last election, the 2000 election, where on the streets people were quite exhausted because they felt that in a swing riding, where I was, there was a lot of strategic type of voting going on. People were asking me, you know, can you regularly send me polling information? They wanted to make their decisions strategically. It took away from a lot of the policies, from good policy proposals. Now, with PR being a possibility, people are quite excited with the possibility that their vote will count. During an election, they can focus on the issues and vote for the issues rather than it being all about strategic voting. Can you guys explain one of the things that we discussed with the Liberals and one of the things I heard on the street was that people they want to engage. They get the ballot. They think, oh, it'll just be a check mark, yes or no. And it isn't. And you get into the other options. And I think that's where people get discouraged, embarrassed, confused. The sense on the street, we talked to some people in Richmond, and a majority of them didn't want to say anything because they didn't know. And they didn't want to look foolish or embarrassed or stupid. So can you talk, our viewers through that are watching now, Sat, we'll go back to you. Thank you, Peter. Talk about the options. It's not just first through the post. There's other options. Can you walk people through what each one of them are and what it all means?
Sure, yeah, no problem. I'll try to do my best on that. So with the way that, and just before I get into the options, I just wanted to make a bit of a plug for Elections BC. But for those of your viewers or your listeners here today who want a bit more information later on, Elections BC has a very helpful guide to the referendum and to the 3 proportional representation electoral systems that we're voting on. The documents, it's about 18 pages long, which sounds a bit daunting, but there's lots of nice graphs and charts in there, so it's actually a pretty quick read. It's a great way of looking at the different systems and how those might look in practice in an electoral system in BC. But turning specifically to the systems themselves, so the first system that is discussed in the guide is dual member proportional representation. So in dual member proportional representation, essentially what you have, if you've got 2 neighboring ridings, they will be paired together into a single riding. So you have a double riding effectively. Okay. And that riding will now be entitled to 2 seats. Now, the first seat in that riding will go to the candidate in that riding that gets the greatest share of the popular vote. So the first past the post type system that we're dealing with here. The second seat in that riding will be allocated based upon the party's share of the popular support province-wide. So that second seat is designed to ensure that the ultimate makeup of the legislature reflects the sort of overall voting preferences of citizens of British Columbia. So it's really a sort of a dual system that you have there. Now, in terms of who will essentially be the person that gets that second seat.
Which is one of the questions, so yeah.
As I said, it's based upon the party share of the popular support province-wide. And the rules have been structured in such a way that if at the end of this process, let's say that the Greens are entitled to 6 additional seats based upon their share of the popular support across the province. Those 6 seats, they will be entitled to the 6 seats in essentially the 6 ridings where their candidate placed second but did the best second place finish across the province.
Okay.
So that way what that does is it ensures that those second candidates or the second MLAs in those larger ridings is the candidate that did well in that particular riding but came up a bit short in terms of their results.
Which would be all, for viewers again, which would be all transparent.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Nicola finishes first, you finish second.
Yeah.
I know that you're going to be the second.
Yeah, like let's say that let's say Nicola and I are from different parties, and she places first. She gets 40% of the vote in a particular a double riding.
Right.
I place second, but let's say I place a really healthy second, so I get 37% of the vote. I come up just short.
Okay.
That's probably enough to get me that second seat in that riding.
Okay.
On the other hand, if I did really poorly, put my foot in my mouth or something like that,
yeah.
I get 15% at the end of the night, I'm probably not going to get that second seat.
Even though you're second?
Even though I'm second, because, sorry, I shouldn't say specifically me, but the party does poorly, right?
The party does poorly.
The party does poorly, and also I do poorly in that riding. I'm not going to get that second seat because I haven't done well in terms of my campaign. So that's essentially dual member. With dual member, in terms of which 2 ridings are going to get consolidated together into a single riding, that's something that hasn't been set yet. Now, some people may look at that and go, well, that's not fair. How do we know which 2 ridings are going to be consolidated? The consolidation process is going to be overseen by an independent electoral boundaries commission, which is the same type of independent body that we use when we allocate new seats to the legislature in British Columbia and we determine what the boundaries are going to look like. So we've, in the last 2005 to 2018, we've added about 8 or 9 seats to the legislature. Where those seats are, what the boundaries look like, that's the type of thing that gets determined by an electoral boundaries commission.
Okay, so we've got dual, mixed, and how about rural-urban proportional?
Yeah, that's a great one. Do you mind actually, can I talk about mixed member first? Because it actually ties back to rural-urban.
We got lots of time.
Okay, thanks. So with mixed member proportional representation, this is a type of system, essentially the same sort of system that they use in New Zealand, and they've been using it for about 20 some odd years with great success. With mixed member proportional representation, when you go to cast your ballot, you essentially are casting 2 votes. You're casting a vote for a candidate and you're casting a vote for a party. And with mixed member proportional representation, again, you're going to see some consolidation of ridings, so there'll be less ridings than there is under the current system, and they'll be larger with a greater share of the population. And then you're going to see a certain percentage of the seats that are going to be allocated based upon the party share of the popular support.
Okay.
So with mixed member proportional representation, those larger ridings, the initial seats are going to be allocated basically on a first-past-the-post type system.
Right.
The candidate who gets the most votes in that larger riding is going to get in. The regional seats that parties will be entitled to are going to be based upon their share of the popular support. Now, in some jurisdictions, it's a share of the popular support across the province or across the country. What has been proposed here is it's actually the share of popular support within those regions. So you're looking at more of a regional focus in terms of allocating those secondary seats in the legislature. So those seats are going to be allocated based upon the share of popular support, and they will go obviously to the parties that have been most successful at generating support in those ridings. Now, there are a few things that still need to get worked out with the mixed member system. One of those issues that has to get worked out is, are you going to have a closed list or an open list system? Now, for your viewers, what those essentially mean, in In a closed list system, you have your sort of party candidates. And in a closed list system, the party picks those candidates, and you either have to vote for them or not. In an open system, you get to choose, well, I like this candidate for the Greens and this candidate for somebody else. You have a bit more flexibility in that. So that's something that will still need to be worked out through a legislative committee. And then also in terms of the consolidation of ridings and the electoral boundaries, again, you're going to have an independent electoral commission that is going to look at that and make those decisions as they do under our current system. So it's a bit of a hybrid system, right? You've got first past the post, which is the system we're using now, and then you've got about 40% or so of the seats, perhaps, that are going to be allocated on the basis of the share of the popular support. So that's mixed member proportional representation. Rural-urban is actually a hybrid system, and for some of your viewers, they may recall the discussions we've had about single transferable votes. That was the system that was being voted on in the last two referendums. So with rural-urban, it's actually quite a unique system that's really, in many ways was designed to sort of capture a province like BC, where we have high concentration of population in urban areas and the belt sort of ridings, and then lesser populations out in the rural areas. With rural-urban, you've essentially got two electoral systems, one for the urban or semi-urban ridings and one for the rural ridings. With the urban or semi-urban ridings, they use this voting system known as single transferable vote. And so what that essentially is, like if you think about our municipal elections, you can elect up to 6 councillors, there's 12 people running, you pick your top 6 in no particular order.
Right.
With single transferable vote, again, it's a list of different. You're going to have essentially consolidated ridings. So let's use Richmond as an example, and we don't know how the boundaries will be decided.
Yeah, that was my next question, because
that'll be up to the Electoral Boundaries Commission, right?
Explain Richmond. Continue. Sorry.
That'll be up to the Electoral Boundaries Commission to determine that. But let's say hypothetically that the 4 Richmond ridings got consolidated into a larger riding.
So, but do you think, sorry to interrupt you, so I was going to ask, you can answer that question then. So they have 4 right now, and 4 MLAs.
Yes.
What is your sense, and I'll open up to the group, collectively, there'll be 2 and not 4? Do you think 2 districts? I mean, that's what people are asking.
Yeah.
Okay, that all sounds great. Break it down for me in black and white. What will my town look like? What will my area look like?
Well, so let's talk about it in the sense of the rural-urban system that we were talking about. So in rural-urban, the urban or semi-urban ridings will be consolidated into larger districts. So let's say let's say that the Electoral Boundaries Commission looks at this and says, well, we think it's appropriate that the 4 Richmond ridings be consolidated into one larger electoral district, because they share a lot of common values, common boundaries, all that sort of stuff.
Okay.
In a hypothetical scenario where the Electoral Commission does that, then Richmond would essentially have a larger electoral district that was one electoral district where previously there were 4 ridings. Now, they're not going to have just one MLA. You're still going to have 4 MLAs.
Is that a guarantee? Like,
under single transferable vote, that's how that would work. And all of the systems are designed to ensure that you're not going to have less MLAs representing your interests.
I think that's a concern, too.
Yeah.
Nicola, you mentioned about there's so much information out there. That was one of the questions.
Yeah. No, and it's a valid one, absolutely. It's important to understand these things. So let's say if we're looking at Richmond, you've got a larger electoral district under the rural-urban system. You've got a single larger electoral district in which you're now electing 4 MLAs, where previously you'd just vote for the MLA and the riding that you live in.
Right.
Now, when you go to cast that ballot, you're going to have a list with 10, 12, 15 names on it, like you'd have in a municipal election in Richmond. And you've got to pick the 4 people that you like the most. They can be Liberals, NDP, Greens, whoever you want.
Okay.
The only difference between the STV system and municipal elections is that in addition to picking the 4 that you like the most, you have to rank them. So you've got to put your first choice first and your 4th choice fourth. You could even do 1 or 2 if you really didn't like the rest of the candidates. Right. But you've got to rank them. And the ranking is important because, if you get a lot of first place votes, that obviously gets you more points. If you get a lot of fourth place votes, it gets you points, but not as many as the first place. And so it's a system whereby, because of the point allocations, essentially what you're getting is a greater increase in chances that people's first, second, third, or fourth choices are going to get into office because they're running up points by all of these ranked ballots. So that's the system essentially that we would be using for sort of urban ridings in areas like Richmond or North Vancouver, where I'm from. In the rural ridings, because they have their own unique aspects in terms of geography and populations being more spread out, things of that sort, they're not going to be using the STV system. They would essentially be using the mixed member system that I was just talking about.
Right.
So in the rural-urban, folks like me who live in the urban ridings, we use the single transferable vote system. Folks who live in the rural ridings, they have that dual vote system. So they vote for their local MLA, and they also do the second vote, which is for a party. And so that way, they still get the first past the post system, which many of them hold dearly, but they also have the ability to vote for the party, and so they can ensure that the rural representation reflects sort of the better sense of the share of the popular support that those rural ridings have.
Okay. Thank you for breaking that down. And that was a big question because, as I said, some of the people that I talked to really did have that feeling of, I just thought it'd be a yes or no on the ballot. Sure, please do. Yes, no, we're all here to do that.
I mean, there's a lot of, naturally it's new systems, three new systems, or one new system that we're looking at with three variants. And naturally there's it takes time to learn about those systems. However, I think it's important to emphasize what they all have in common. And what they all have in common is the end result is quite simple. And the end result is that if a party has 30% of the vote, they get 30% of the seats. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important, very simple outcome. In contrast with the current system, when a party with 39% of the vote gets a majority government, or in some cases there's been, for example, in the Maritimes, a party with fewer votes ended up getting more seats. Right. And for me, that's quite confusing as a voter. How is that possible? So the outcome here is what's great. It's simple. It's a fair proportion based on votes. In addition, a great advantage is the fact that your ridings are going to be represented by more than one MLA, and as a result, you have more representation, often across party lines. So it's more likely with PR that you'll have representation from the party that you support closer to you.
Can I add something?
Certainly, please. No, we got time. You jump in. It's a conversation, so you got all the time.
Yeah, so to add to that, I mean, you look at systems like they have in England and in the U.S., and you look at some of these votes that we see, such as the one in the 2016 election for Donald Trump, where he was elected, but Hillary Clinton had the popular vote. Yeah. So that's one of those instances where the will of the American people wasn't reflected in their government. So we're looking to have that changed here. And it's also important to note that we have three proposals on the table. All of them achieve proportionality, so all of them are creating a more fair and democratic system. But if you don't know which of those three you want to vote for, and I think Sat very clearly outlined them better than I've heard anywhere else, so thank you for that, Sat. But if you're still not sure which one you want to vote for, but you do want to make sure that we have proportional representation, you don't have to tick that second piece of the ballot. You can just vote for proportional representation.
It's interesting because I talked to some of my friends who live in California. I was talking about doing this, and you mentioned the election, the electoral versus the popular vote. One of the problems my friends have living in California is they've got a population of about 50 million people with 2 senators, and North Dakota has 800,000 people and has 2 senators. It drives them nuts. And I know the Founding Fathers presented it that way, but it drives them nuts that it's not representing populations well enough. But Nicole, I'll stay with you because one of the things talking about the three options that Sat pointed out, one of the questions was, well, okay, I know that because Sat, you mentioned New Zealand, I believe Sweden, Netherlands uses this type of structure. Is it true that two of the three options on the ballot have never been used before? Would you know that?
I would argue that one of the three options has never been used before, and that
okay.
would be DMP. And the reason I say that is that rural-urban is a combination of single transferable vote and MMP. So that's a system that has been tested, or the two aspects of the system has been tested and proved. So arguably only DMP is the one that hasn't been used. And it was something that was invented in Canada to be used for Canada and for British Columbia. So it's a system that's sort of designed to work well here.
Okay. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Sad, you?
Oh, just one point to add. And so to Nicola's comment about rural-urban having a combination of MMP and the STV system, or single transferable vote. I don't have the jurisdictions on the top of my finger here, but I believe there are a few subnational jurisdictions where they use a variant of the single transferable vote system. But in the end of the day, I mean, the single transferable vote system, I think it's important to bear in mind. I mean, this is the system that the Liberals were promoting when they were in power, and they were advocating for electoral reform. So this idea that rural-urban is sort of an electoral boogeyman that people don't understand, aren't familiar with. I mean, the urban and semi-urban ridings are going to be using a system under urban and rural that is a system that the Liberals championed for a number of years. So, you know, there is some familiarity with the system.
Okay, and I'll open this up to either you or Peter. You can jump in here. One of the questions was, okay, and again, I really like it. I'm hoping that people watching today are watching every segment, whether you believe in the Green, the Liberals, or the NDP, because I want everybody to see all sides in a very relaxed, non-interrupting type fashion here. One of the questions, and we asked the last group from the Liberals, okay, this has been approached several times in the last few years. What is different this time? And Seth, we'll start with you. Look at the camera, whatever you want to do, and give that viewer out there why it's different this time.
Well, you know, I think the fundamental difference this time is the voters have been given a series of choices in terms of their preferences. And so, you know, with the last two referendum, it was, you know, do you want to switch to an STV system or not? With this particular referendum, I think there's one of the benefits of it is that there's a rather simple question: do you prefer to switch to that system and use proportional representation? And then if you do, what are your preferences in terms of those different options that have been given to you? So I think that having that choice is actually a good thing for voters. It allows them to express their own particular electoral sensibilities in a more specific or unique manner. The other thing that I would say that's different about this is that, you know, under this current proposal, what we're talking about here is electoral reform on a trial basis. You know, if proportional representation passes, the intention would be that it's implemented for the 2021 general election, and then it's used for 2 electoral cycles. And at the end of that, there will be a further referendum where people will have the choice to switch back. So, you know, that is done to create the sort of greatest amount of flexibility for people, to give people power over the process. And if they ultimately, at the end of that two electoral cycle, decide that they don't like it, they can switch back. Now, we personally think once they've used it for a couple cycles, they're going to become very, very comfortable with that. And if you look around the world, that's certainly what's been borne out. I mean, I don't think there's any jurisdiction that has adopted proportional representation that is then switched back to a first-past-the-post system. So I don't think that would happen, but people have that option if they choose to, if they feel that it isn't working for them. So, you know, I think from my personal perspective, having that choice and say over the matter is empowering for voters.
Okay. Certainly, of course, yes.
I think that the other difference between this referendum and past is the threshold. So it's a 50+1 threshold where the two systems of proportional representation and first past the post are evenly distributed, evenly split in terms of the power that the vote holds when you're selecting one of those systems. Whereas in the past, we've seen a 60+1 threshold, and that has put things in favor of first past the post. It's really stacked the deck in favor of our current system. So this is, again, like proportional representation, a more fair and democratic system.
Okay. One of the other questions, I brought this up with our last segment, and I'd love you guys to jump in here and, again, talk to our viewers about this. Talking about information out there. Nicola, you brought that up earlier. One of the questions, is it true that 60% of the MLAs will be voted in, 40% will be appointed from a candidate list privately set by the party in power?
So far, I've heard both the NDP and the Greens speak out in favor of open party lists. So no, that would not be the case. What would happen is the party would put forward candidates that they approve of, that have been selected through a nomination process, similar to how candidates are selected right now. And then voters would have a chance to select which candidates they feel are going to best represent them from that list, as well as the candidates that best represent them in their local area, in their riding.
Just, I mean, because I think that, you know, it's easy to get very cynical with politics, of course. And I think what I was hearing after that question was, yeah, but that just leads to cronyism and all that stuff. And so that's what I'm hoping you guys can really settle from your point of view today, that this is not a backroom, you know, 1940s, all the king's men kind of Louisiana politics where you're voting on cigar smoke and this guy's being picked because he's friends with that guy. That's honestly what people were saying to me.
And that's a lot of the misinformation that has been spread by the no side, and I think that's something that we're trying to counter, is that we're not looking at implementing closed party lists that are decided behind closed doors without the input of members. It's going to be a list that's selected by the membership of each individual party, and then voters will have a chance to decide if the folks on those lists are ones that they want to see representing them in the legislature.
Okay. Peter, why don't you jump in here with this question? Thank you, Nicola. One of the things I think, again, because people are just trying to find their way in the dark if they're not up to speed, if they're used to, say, voting for Nicola, who's in Richmond, and they want to make an appointment to see them. How will this affect who they see? I mean, people, I think, were a little worried as well that, oh, well, wait a minute, I won't know who I can go see, who gets elected. Can you answer that? Not fear, but just maybe confusion.
Yes, I mean, under all three systems, you will have you'll have more than one representative, one or more representatives for your area, whether it be that it's on a riding basis or a riding in a region. As I mentioned before, one of the great advantages of this is that you will more likely have MLAs who are from the party that you voted for closer to you. So, you know, currently in the system that we have, really half the province ends up being, you know, NDP and half Liberal, and often, and as the majority government swings from one to the other, you often half the province feels underrepresented. With PR, you'll have, like I said, more representation. You can call them up the same way that you do now, but you'll have more of them, and it's more likely that you'll have one that you support closer to you.
Okay, good answer. Thank you. Jump in, Seth.
Just wanted to, just to add to that,
Sure.
Certainly echo Peter's comments. I wanted to just give your listeners an example from Richmond, because I think that's always important to have that kind of context. So if we were using this single transferable vote system that I talked about for rural urban,
right.
Where you have a ranked ballot, and if we look just simply at the way that the electoral voting broke down in the last cycle, where the NDP in Richmond got 38-39% of the vote, it's reasonable to expect that at least one, if not two, of the 4 Richmond seats might have gone to an NDP candidate.
Right.
So if there was a voter in Richmond who more closely affiliated themselves with the NDP, they would actually have an NDP MLA that they could go speak to. If you were looking at this, the dual member system that we talked about earlier, where you have 2 ridings consolidated into one, the first seat goes to the candidate who got the most seats in that riding. In one of those larger ridings, it would have been the Liberals, because they came out ahead in all of them. However, if you look, for example, in Richmond, I apologize, I don't recall which riding it was, but there was certainly one riding where the NDP candidate got very, very close to the Liberal. They were real close second. That's the type of situation where that second seat may well have gone to that NDP candidate because they came such a close second, right? So again, the benefit, as Peter said, is that yes, you'll have larger ridings, but you'll still have the same number of MLAs, if not 1 or 2 more, representing you, and you're more likely to have an MLA from the party that you support as a local representative that you can contact. So it's an NDP candidate, you can reach out to them. If you're one of our supporters, you'll be able to reach out to your local Green MLA. So it just gives people more choice.
Okay, and again, just to reiterate, I know people really do identify their own backyard, don't they? As we've all said that. So in Richmond, where we've had 4, that will not decrease.
No, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So under all 3 of the systems, none of the systems contemplate a reduction in the overall number of MLAs.
Right.
In terms of how many MLAs there will be in the legislature at the end of this process, currently there's 87. The maximum that it could increase to would be 95. So the maximum additional number of MLAs would be 8 across the entire province, but there's no guarantee we would necessarily increase by 8. Okay. So wherever you're from, you're not going to get less MLAs. You may get 1 more.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that was something else that people were trying to sift through is, am I losing representation? Is it decreasing? But no. So you have 4 here.
No, not at all.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things that we talked in the last segment, and I think it plagues us all, Nicola, you mentioned, of course, the American election and midterms recently, and one of the commonalities I think we have with our 2 systems, though they're very different, is this voter apathy amongst the millennials. They were talking about it the other night that I think the millennial turnout was like 15% in the midterm elections, which is up, but still horrible. I talked to Andrew Wilkinson about this. I'll throw this out to you guys and all their MLAs that we talked about it too. How do you get to the millennials? Because I'm near the end and the beginning at my age. So we're really taught this is their future, not mine, really. And so how do you reach out to the millennials? Because they're passionate about their causes. And I said this earlier that they demand a social conscience with their brands. We saw that with Nike recently. But how do we reach them? I'll start with you, Sam. We'll work around the table.
Yeah, no, look, that's a great question. I mean, it's one of the things I would say in terms of the benefits of proportional representation is that if you look at sort of the studies that have looked at that system from around the world, generally speaking, they tend to have much higher turnout levels in terms of voting in general elections than you see in first past the post. So that increase in engagement generally is a good thing for democracy. I think it also, I haven't broken down those numbers, but I expect that part of that increase in voting is you've got higher turnout from younger voters, from so-called millennials, folks like that. In terms of the engagement aspect, I think that if you're looking at a legislature that more closely reflects the share of popular support that different parties get, I think you're going to see a situation where younger voters that may previously felt like they didn't have a voice are going to feel more strongly like they have somebody that they can reach out to that shares their values, that they can reach out to and advocate for changes in policy or things of that sort. I think one of the things too, and it's just sort of an aspect of why the Greens like proportional representation, is that one of the things we like about that system is it forces people to negotiate, to try to cooperate, find common ground, things of that sort. We live in a day and age where picking on your opponents is the easy way out, right?
Oh, it gets you votes,
and
of course,
it gets you votes, but it also turns people off of voting generally because they look at how politicians are behaving and they go, like, this isn't how I want to live my life. I've got enough harassment on the internet without having to turn into the legislature and see them name calling and stuff like that. So I think if we move to that sort of a system where people are forced to have to negotiate and cooperate and find compromise, it will help to produce an electoral system that is more caring and more thoughtful, more willing to listen to different viewpoints. And I think ultimately that will draw people into to our electoral system and want them to engage and participate more than they currently do.
I think what you noted there, and I said this, I was at a party the other night with friends, and we don't often all agree politically, but all of us agreed how exasperating and exhausting, and I think I can say this online, pissed off we all were the other night by that debate. Not doubting the passion and sincerity of both people that were in that debate, the Premier and Mr. Wilkinson, but it did nothing. And so that's what really today is about, is to sit down and have an honest conversation and get everyone's point of views. Okay, Peter, I'll jump to you with this next. One of the things that, we apologize for the microphone here, there's a little throwback to the 1960s.
Can I actually add something to the last question?
Please do, of course. Yes.
No, I mean, from my experience at the, like I said, at the 2017 election, one of the things I enjoyed the most was actually going to debate at the high schools. I absolutely loved it because of the incredible passion that young people have for issues, especially issues that relate to sort of the long term, the environment, for example. But they are frustrated with the current system because if they're in a riding which is has been an NDP riding for the last 5 elections, or a liberal riding, they feel that their vote doesn't matter. And if the vote doesn't matter, they end up just not taking part. In addition to that, I found that a lot of people found they found that the framing of the election was framed in terms of one sort of universe or the other, either the NDP or the Liberal.
Right.
And so they felt that to be, for example, a swing riding, they had to really choose between those things. So you had, for example, somebody who had been an NDP supporter, and they didn't like the context or the framing of their current platform for the election, but they disliked the Liberals. They found that they didn't really have a voice that was heard. With PR, your vote is always going to count, and that's going to make people feel engaged and bring them into the elections, especially the millennials, who are they have it in their heart, and currently they're expressing it in brands they buy, like you mentioned, but now the electoral system will work for them in terms of.
Just before I ask my next question, sticking with millennials, one last thing that I'm curious, and again, we asked it in our last session, is really how, again, going back to my question, how do you get to them? Because I think just the whole, the construction of just the hard copy ballot is something they don't relate to anymore. It's like when I get a kid in a coffee shop seeing me reading the newspaper. What she does is good. What I do is good. It fits for everybody. Can we make this better so we can get to those people? I just wondered if a kid is lucky enough to get a ballot, I've talked to a couple of kids that it was in the garbage before they even opened it. And that's, again, I'm wondering, how do we reach them without going through this? This is great, but I'm wondering, is there a way we can reach these kids electronically or something in terms of, for important, this is their future. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I just ran in Coquitlam in the municipal election, and that was a huge challenge for us, was getting the vote percentage up and trying to reach millennial candidates, because I'm a millennial myself, and I want to be able to connect with that group of people. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is by reaching out to folks on their level, and that level is social media at the moment.
You're articulating them better than I just did. That's what I was trying to say. How do I reach them on where they'll be?
Right, and so I think putting together informative videos, perhaps, that are both entertaining and informative, making sure that we're looking at the platforms that different age groups use. I mean, Instagram is much more popular with the younger crowd, and then as you move up in age, you're looking at platforms like Facebook. YouTube is another great platform, but the way that you gain attention on YouTube tends to be through dramatic stunts, right? So maybe it's through sponsored ads on creators' videos, right? That's something I've never seen before. I've seen plenty of advertisements on YouTube through creators for things like, well, I don't want to promote any brands here, but for certain brands. Yep. I've never seen one for a political movement or for a political system, right? And so that's an untapped market. I think we need to look at new and creative ways of engaging with people, but also, as these two gentlemen have mentioned, it's about making sure that we also have a system where people can feel represented. And right now, most of my peers feel that the current system doesn't elect people that they want to see in government. Okay. So they feel like their vote's thrown out, and why bother voting at all? So a shift in a shift in system will help with that.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up soon. I want to ask one other question, because one of the other pieces of information that I didn't get from a person on the street, but that I kept seeing on the arguments against is, well, yes, the you mentioned New Zealand, and I think Sweden and Netherlands is how much longer it can take to set a government in place if we were to vote yes to this. We'll let one of you answer, all of you want it. You want to start, Nicola? Go ahead.
I think, Sat, do you have a better answer for this one?
Yeah. No, look, I mean, look, that's it's a valid question. We can all point to examples of countries where government has become more dysfunctional. And opponents of proportional representation will point to examples from European countries where it's been difficult to form government, or they've got lots of turnover.
Coalitions are fragile, yes.
Things like that, right? The one thing I would say just in terms of that, first, we have to bear in mind about 85% of Western countries use proportional representation. So there's a much larger sample size to try to pick a bad apple. Okay. The other thing I would say is, we need to be mindful of the fact that under the first-past-the-post system, we can also see that. So the classic example is the United States. We've got a first-past-the-post system there, and it's completely it's quite chaotic the way that politics is running there. So the challenges of electoral reform and ensuring that there's properly functioning governments are one that aren't unique to proportional representation. They exist in all political systems. More fundamentally, though, I think in the end of the day, the success of proportional representation ties back to how do you approach politics, right? And speaking from the BC Greens perspective, we've always viewed politics as one where compromise, negotiation, the striving for common ground are things that are fundamentally important to the functioning of democracy. One of the things that we have tried to espouse since we've been in a greater role in the legislature over the last year and a half, we want to try to act like the adults in the room, right? Find common ground with our opponents. We've reached out to the Liberals, for example, on a number of occasions to try to get their support and buy-in on things that we feel we could do to improve on what the NDP is doing. We haven't been successful with that yet, although we always remain hopeful. But fundamentally, it comes down to are you prepared to try to work with your opponents to find common ground and craft policy that people can live with? We're certainly prepared to do that if the electorate votes to change the system, and we think that when we do that, it can be very successful. And we look at countries like New Zealand. Nobody's looking at New Zealand going, "Oh my God, it's fallen apart." It's a wonderful, stable democracy. It's they've got great leadership there, and you've got a makeup of their legislature that much more closely resembles the voting sensibilities of their voters.
Okay. Yes, before you jump in, though, Nicola, I was going to say we're going to wrap up soon, but that was a great end statement. I'll go to you and then to Peter. So this is where we want to do and if you want to throw one more in at the end, sure, thank you. Really want to, you make your comment then, Nicola, but we also want to, did this in our last segment, really want to give one of those 30-second pitches. So say what you're going to say, and then we'll get you to your 30-second.
Sure. I mean, one thing that I haven't heard mentioned today is the threshold, the 5% threshold to prevent extremist parties. And something that Andrew Wilkinson brought up during the PR debate was his fear that there may be a system in place that could elect an extremist party. But he also said, I don't want a system where 5% of the votes are thrown out. Well, the 5% is there to prevent extremist parties from getting elected. And when you look at our current system, when 39% of the votes give a party 100% of the power, that means that 61% of the votes are thrown out versus a system where less than 5% are not represented in the legislature. So again, I think that's what creates a more fair and democratic system, and it's what elects a government that better represents the people of our province.
Okay, well said. Peter, we'll give you the last word.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in terms of stability, I mean, if we were to look at cases such as in the States with Trump unraveling really the policies of Obama, or what's going on in Ontario where the previous government's policies are all being unraveled, well, this is indicative of a majority government system where constantly, going back, for example, in BC from NDP to Liberal, a lot of the time there's more emphasis on reverting to, and rolling back the policies of the previous government. With PR systems around the world, such as in New Zealand, the emphasis is on working together and coming up with long-term policies, long-term solutions that are more for the whole population, but also as opposed to quick fixes and quick fix policies basically to try to win elections.
Okay. Guys, I want to thank you on behalf of myself and our crew working behind the cameras here today, and of course the Richmond Center. We appreciate you joining us on a busy work day, and it was a great discussion. Thank you. This is what we need more of, not quick sound bites and yelling and screaming and talking over everybody. Okay, it's Sat Harwood. He is the Chair of Provincial Council for the BC Green Party. We also had Nicholas Sperling, who was a BC Green spokesperson and appears on CBC Radio Early Edition. We didn't get a chance to ask you what it's like working early, but do you enjoy that?
I do. Yeah, no, I love my time on the Early Edition.
Excellent. Well, That's the shift to be on if you're on radio or television. That's good. And Peter, it was great to have you. We didn't know you were coming in, but glad to have you, and thank you for contributing to the conversation. Peter Helschmidt is the Green Party candidate in the last election and spokesperson. Okay, if you have any questions about what we're talking about today, you can always go to elections.bc.ca, or you can also go to elections.bc.ca/referendum. Or old-fashioned way, pick up the phone, 1-800-661-8683. Speaking of questions, we have one right now.
Well, I'm going to have to sit down for several hours to wade through the paperwork and figure out what it means. I think my biggest problem is I don't know what it means, and I've seen these referendums many times before, and they've always failed because nobody understands what the implications are, or they're so broad that they just don't want to change anything. So I haven't given a lot of time, partly because it's either complicated or it just hasn't been well explained, or both.
So what question would you like explained?
I'd love to see some modeling to say, well, given the past few elections, what difference would this system have made? It's really hard to tell. The old approach has its problems, but it's like flipping a coin. That sometimes happens too in ties. I don't know, is it better or worse?
Welcome back to the Quilchena Golf Course here in the heart of Richmond, and we are up to our final segment. We're going to get to that in just a few seconds. Of course, thank you all for watching. I've been hearing that the views have been quite good. This is all about the referendum coming up at the end of this month. It is important. It's about your future, and it's about voting. We're back here with Richmond Sentinel's editor, the guys that are putting this on, Martin Vandenhamel. I'm calling you Martin, what do I call you? Martin FDH is what I'm calling you. Yeah, that's right. Okay, we're down to our last segment, and certainly not last but least, anything like that, but we've got the NDBs coming up next. Again, let's just kind of sum up what you've seen so far today.
Yeah, during the first hour, we had Andrew Wilkinson in with our four Liberal MLAs, Linda Reid, John Yap, Teresa Watt, and Jazz Johal, and they presented their viewpoint. It was a fantastic hour. And then we had the Green Party in as well. We had Sat Harwood in, and a couple other members of the Green Party, and they gave a fantastic perspective on why they think the system needs to change. And now we've got somebody that's intimately connected to the potential change, and absolutely we encourage people to do their homework and participate.
And we should mention too, we also offered to put the offer out to the Green Party head, Mr. Weaver, and couldn't make it, but did send some qualified people. Yeah, it's been really interesting to hear. It's been good to hear it in kind of a, we only got 2 minutes and then we got to get to a commercial kind of thing, a really open forum, and we're going to continue that. You, of course, will join me at the very end. Martin, we'll look forward to your comments at the very end. It's Martin Vandenhamel. He is the editor of the Richmond Sentinel, which, of course, is putting this on. Thanks, Martin. We'll come back to you at the end of the segment. Okay, we're coming back over to the table for the third and final time, and that is to talk to the NDP. Before we get to that, though, 1 second, we got to do a little homework here. We want to remind you once again, if you have more questions, comments, if you really want to get some more information, of course, you can go to the election, bc.ca/referendum, or you can simply call 1-800-661-8683. We'll give that information out again a little later in the show. And because we're live, we got to always be prepared. We've got the handheld mic up here as well. Okay, we're here for our last segment. I want to welcome Amandeep Singh. He was an NDP candidate in BC's 2017 election and a referendum spokesman. Thanks for joining us today on a busy work day.
Thank you, Jim.
What we've been saying throughout the day to your counterparts in the other parties is that we really wanted to get something that we could present where it was simplistic, not simple, but simplistic, just answers for the viewers, people watching at home, because one of the things we've seen, the thread line through our discussions with people on the street is, okay, I want to be engaged. I know it's important, but I'm just confused. There's so much information out there. This is why today is so very important. That's why we wanted to give everybody as much time without talking heads, because the other thing we heard a lot was that both men were very passionate about their arguments and their debate points the other night on television, but people walked away angry and exasperated. That, you know what, yeah, both guys mean well, they've got their points, they're passionate about their argument in the debate, but too much talking over each other. So we're not doing that today. So, perfect. Enough introduction. Okay, let's get to you, Amandeep. I'm going to ask you pretty much the same questions we've been asking everybody today, but for you, we're going to start with a question that not everybody, but a lot of people were asking me, and that was, okay, I know that this has happened before. Why the change? Why is it needed?
Well, it's the NDP, frankly, campaigned on it. It was in their platform. And the voters, it was in the Green platform, I believe, as well. The voters came out overwhelmingly and That's the government that we have, so they're following through on their platform. Plus, it's it is the national evolution of our voting systems, right? This is we endeavor to make things better, and we believe that this is the natural evolution of making what we have under first past the post, of making it better, making a better system that correctly and most accurately reflects what voters want.
Okay, and another question I've been asking everybody throughout the day is what are you hearing when you're out there talking to people? Not just of your party, people on the street that may be leaning your way, maybe not. Talk about what you're hearing from those folks.
Well, one of the first things that you hear is people are familiar with it. They were subsumed with the civic elections, a bit unfortunate. They were subsumed with that, but they are familiar with it now.
Yeah.
And they're just getting into the guts with it right now. And what I do hear, and we spoke about this before as well, is when I'm at the door and I'm speaking with people about it, they want to know more. And so they're actually taking their time. I'm finding that people are actually going to be taking their time researching these issues far more than I did during the provincial election, right? That people are actually interested, and they're taking their time to find out what exactly proportional representation is and what the different systems that are proposed are and why we should be doing this.
Let's talk, and again, because we're getting, I'm really hoping, and we've said this a couple times today, that our viewers out there, and we appreciate you tuning in today, I'm really hoping that as many viewers as possible will stay and watch all the segments, because you need to see every side and then put your thoughts together. Can you talk a bit about give me your explanation, because one of the things we did find as well is that people were assuming that the ballot would come with just yes, no. And it's not, and immediately it's a little intimidating, because if you are confused and you're searching out the information, it is difficult. Can you talk to me a bit about the genesis of how this came together? Were the other parties involved? And walk people through the four options that they really have.
Right. So, this online consultation process over the last few months, and what came out of the so what we have now. Is what came out of that consultation process. And the consultation was not just with community members, but with organizations, them speaking across the board with the caucus members of the Liberal Party, the Green Party. And what came out of that was that, a simple yes-no question was probably not the way to go.
Really? Can you expand on that a little bit? Because that's I'm happy to hear that, but you take it from there.
So I think what the government did here, and again, this is speaking from the outside a little bit.
Sure.
Is they looked at it and they wanted to present something that wasn't just a yes and no answer where the real decisions were decided afterwards. They wanted to make it more democratic, effectively. Apparently my mic isn't working, so this is better.
I think we're catching up, but thank you, Peter.
Where they wanted to make it more democratic, more reflective, so they wanted to give people options, right? They didn't want one of the arguments that you see or that you hear from the other side, from the no side, is all these things are going to be decided afterwards. Well, that's specifically why the government went with this method. They wanted to put out there. They had a few, one, they wanted to bring on a system that's more proportional. So if you get 20% of the seats, you get 20% of the power. Not unlike now, where you get, in general, in our elections and elections across North America, you've seen parties that get 35 to 40% of the seat of the vote get 100% of the power. Yeah. So they wanted to see proportionality come in. They from that feedback. They heard, what was heard was that local representation was very important. Okay. So that was very important to keep in this. That's why all of these systems are a mixture. They're made in BC. All of them are essentially made in BC. Things like mixed member and the other systems are used, single transferable votes are used in different countries in the world. But what the Attorney General wanted to do is he wanted to make a made for BC solution. So proportionality, it had to be proportional to local ridings. So you have to have your local representation.
And so can you unpack that a little more for our viewers?
Absolutely.
One of the things that I know I was hearing a lot of on the streets of Richmond this week was, okay, we've got 4 areas, we've got 4 ridings, we got 4 MLAs. I don't want to lose that.
Yep.
Can you expand on that a little?
You don't lose that, right? Under all of the different systems that you have that are proposed, you will still have your the ridings may look different, right? They may be bigger, right? They'll generally be bigger. And you'll also, depending on the system, you may also have a regional riding as well. But you still have your local MLA. And in fact, it's even better. You have 2 MLAs that are local. You know what essentially is local, right? What is the difference between someone that lives in the east side of Richmond to someone that lives all the way in the west side of Richmond, right? I would say that a regional representative would be able to represent both. So under all three systems, you do get to vote for your local MLA, but you also get to vote for, under whatever system it is, for a proportional MLA, right? For someone who gets put into that seat under the proportionality.
Okay, and walk us through that again for our viewers that say, okay, sorry, I was with you, and then so I'm voting for the person, I'm voting for you.
Well, let's go through the systems.
Because I like, okay.
Let's go through the systems.
Start with dual member proportional.
So it looks exactly like the ballot that we have now. Okay. So that's one of the advantages of it, is that we're familiar with that ballot. And so ridings will essentially be doubled, right? Some of the rural ridings won't be doubled in size; they won't be combined because they're so big. So they'll stay essentially the same way that they are. But ridings would be coupled here, and the ballot would have two names. So the NDP would have two names, A and B, right? The Liberals would have two names, C and D, and as would the Greens, as would the Conservative Party, and all the other parties that rule. So the first choice, the first name, would be the local MLA that you're voting for. Okay. Right. And so that would be
which you're doing now.
Yeah, which you're doing now, right? Okay. And then based on the proportion, the overall vote proportion, right? Overall vote proportion in British Columbia, that second MLA, that second name that's there, would be assigned, would be put in to create that proportionality within the province or within that region. So that's dual member. So you're still, and again, you know who those two people are, right? You know who you're voting for, right? If you're a member of that party, if you're a member of the Liberal Party, those people have probably gone through a nomination process and gotten their names in that ballot in that way. So fairly similar in that way to what we have now. Mixed member, right?
I was going to say, so somebody said to me on the street that, well, yeah, but I can vote for this person who's Liberal, but then I can also vote for this person, like yourself, like your NDP.
Yep. So that's a great thing about mixed member. That's the second system that's proposed, mixed member proportionality. Ridings would be clumped into a region, so you would be voting for your local MLA, right? So I ran in Richmond, Queensborough. So, and hypothetically, say all of Richmond was one region, right? You in Richmond, Queensborough, you'd be voting for your local Richmond, Queensborough MLA, plus you would be voting for a regional MLA that would be able to represent all of Richmond, essentially. So if you didn't like the way that I spoke with you, or you weren't as happy with me, you could, but you really like the NDP's policies, you could vote for one of the other MLAs, right? You could vote for one of the Green MLAs or the Liberal MLAs or the Conservative MLAs. But because you like the NDP policy, you could put your vote for a regional MLA for the NDP. Okay. And that way you get, your vote actually counts. What happened, for example, what happened here in Richmond is you've got 4 MLAs who were on here earlier. Yeah. Right? You've got 4 MLAs, all from one party. Yet, if you look at the vote, if you look at the actual vote count, the way that the vote went, and I don't know the figures for the other ones, but I do know for Richmond, Queensborough, 40% of the people voted for the BC Liberals. About the same amount voted for the NDP, and then the rest was split up. So about 60% of voters, their votes essentially didn't count. What proportional representation does is it makes every vote count in one way or another.
Was there a discussion amongst your party when you're consulting about offering a number of choices? Was there? Could you not just offer one option other than first past post? I mean,
absolutely, they could have done that. And again, I'm not privy to those discussions, but I think what the Attorney General did here was really, to do that would have been a disservice to the electorate, to the voters. What he did was he put out a choice. And I think it was a conscious decision that there's a lot of the no side has put out a lot of information saying that this is really confusing. I would argue with that. I would say it's not confusing; it's unfamiliar. If you take a few seconds, to look at it, it's actually fairly simple. But over 90 countries in the world use some form of proportional representation, and I think he wanted to give British Columbians a choice. Here, we want proportional representation. We want, if you get 40% of the vote, we want you to get 40% of the seats in the legislature. But here are different ways of getting there, right? All 3 options. Doesn't matter what options you use, all 3 options get you there. Okay. And again, as I said, over 90 countries in the world use this, right? The first past the post system is an antiquated system that comes from our history. Right?
Yes, right. Yes,
it comes from our history, comes from the history of the crown, comes from the four sort of four most robust democracies that don't use proportional representation. Only 4 of them use the U.S., Canada, England, and India are the 4 sort of outliers. Pretty much everybody else uses proportional representation. First past the post comes from a time and an era where you had 2 parties, right? Yeah. And it works really well in a 2-party system, right? Because you have to have a majority. It comes from the time when feudal lords wanted to wrest power away from the crown, from the king and the queen. So this voting system comes from that part where you had the queen or the king's party, a party that favored the crown, and then you had a party that favored more the feudal landlords. So 2 parties. The party that got more than 50% of the vote, the majority of the vote, formed parliament. Makes sense in a 2-member, 2-party state. It doesn't make sense when you have a plurality of parties. When you have at least 4 or 5 big parties in British Columbia, you've got the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, and the Conservatives. And in this situation, what generally happens is parties that get between 35 and 40% of the vote end up getting 100% of the power, and 60% plus of the electorate gets left out in the cold.
What do you say to people then? That's another question I heard. Again, you're right. It's unfamiliar, matched with so much information. It's trying to assess it all. But
absolutely.
What about for people that would say then, well, we've done this a couple times already. We've tried this a couple times. How do you respond to that then?
Well, I mean, no reason not to try again, especially when again, it was in the platform for the NDP and the Greens. People wanted. There's a thirst out there for change, especially in a time and an era where people are feeling that votes don't count, where they have to go out and strategically vote, right? So you saw that thirst for a change in our electoral system, not only in the provincial elections but also in the federal elections. I will argue that one of the reasons that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals were able to do so well is because they promised electoral reform. They promised, I think his famous thing was, this will be the last first past the post election. They went back on that because first past the post works really well for vested interests and vested parties, right? But you saw a thirst for electoral reform there. The turnout is low. People feel that their vote doesn't count. And I think that has to be addressed, and I think that's why we're doing this again.
Speaking of voting, and one of the things I've brought up in the last 2 segments is getting people attracted to voting. And you're right, you hit on a couple notes there. When people are unfamiliar or uninformed, so much information floating around out there. How do you engage people? And I'm going to say specifically the millennial group. Everybody I've talked to today, we all agree on that this is their future, not ours.
Absolutely.
But it's getting to them and getting them to vote.
But I have no fear with that. I've been out in the doors.
Okay.
I did a debate or a talk at UBC on Friday. I think it's the other way around. I think the millennials and I think the younger generation have a lot. I see a lot of hope in them, and I feel that they're the ones that are saying, hey, I want to know more about this, and I'm actually looking into it. If you've got some resources, give them to me. I think we just had an election in south of us, and I think young voters came out in numbers. I think we're going to see that change. I think
it came out in numbers, but I said last year, improvement, but still
absolutely
not good. But you're right, it did go up.
Yep.
It's also, are you guys in your discussions? And I posed this to both the Green and the Liberal colleagues that were here, about reaching them on their platform.
Yep.
Because I think this is just antiquated to them, in my opinion. Not the idea, the presentation.
That's why you have all these great organizations out there that are non-aligned, going out there and doing this work and pushing it. So you've got Vote PRBC, which I'm also a spokesperson for, Fair Vote, Dogwood, Lead Now, all these organizations that do reach out to millennials and are reaching out to them and putting it in a more palatable form.
That's
the old bureaucratic.
Yes, of course.
Old bureaucratic. So, and I encourage the listeners to go out there and look at those different forms. There's great. I did a presentation / debate a few weeks ago at this small organization. It's called a pop-up policy event in Yaletown, and there was a young man there who had made a video on proportional representation. He'd
Okay.
taken as instead of parties, he'd use Hogwarts and Star Wars and Star Trek and use those to make
That
an
reaches.
explanation.
That
reaches. It was fantastic. It's like a 15, 20-minute video.
Right.
I think his Facebook page is This Here Vancouver or something. And he did a really good job of explaining it.
Very cool. As I said, they got to get out and take part.
I think they will. I think they will. I've been door knocking. I've been out on the doors, knocking on doors, canvassing, talking to people about this, and I'm actually quite amazed and quite surprised and quite pleased.
I am pleasantly surprised and happy to hear you say that if you're out in the front lines doing that. Okay, one of the other questions that did come up amongst people we spoke with, as I said, I've certainly been very honest on my feelings with everybody who's been here today about the debate the other night. I just don't think it connected. But there was one moment in the debate where the Premier was asked about how many MLAs BC will end up with under the new system. And it was just a yes or no answer. Can you give me, and he didn't. And it was amongst all the yelling and everything like that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was another question that came up. Again, because there's so much information out there, they just want to know.
I think the number that's out there is between 87 and 95. We have 87 now?
I think 87? 87, thank you. Yeah,
87, it won't be below 87,
okay.
But it won't be more than 95.
I appreciate the answer on that, because another thing was that, as I think I said to you earlier in our last segment about, I've got 4 MLAs here. I don't want to go down to 2.
Yep.
So it'll do nothing but go up a bit.
It'll go up a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that'll be unpacked.
Well, if
it's a yes, depending on which system they use, it'll be unpacked over a period of time.
All party committee. The boundaries, the regions will be drawn up by the Electoral Boundaries Commission. Okay. Fairly similar to what's done in between elections anyway. Okay. Right. We don't in between elections when the census comes in, boundaries are changed, right? And a boundaries commission, Electoral Boundaries Commission, does that. Elections BC will have a lot of work to do. The details, further details will be taken to an all-party committee. Okay. So everybody's involved. I think that's why they say it's going to take some time. That's the other reason why the referendum is happening right now, why this is happening right now, because when this passes and we get to choose a system, the first possible election we could have under a new system wouldn't be until July of 2021.
21, okay.
Yeah, so I think that that gives it a lot of time for people to have their input, for the all-party committee to have their input, and for Elections BC and the Boundaries Commission to be able to make all of those decisions that they make anyway.
In a slow pace, which is good. Okay. That kind of leads me into a couple questions, kind of a two-parter, and that is people asking, okay, how much more money is this going to cost us? And also, this is my own reading, I didn't have anybody say this, but one of the comments I've been reading a lot of from the no side is that these governments, once in place under the system, can take a long time to set up, 300, 400, 500 days. Two-part question there, and you choose to answer in the order you want.
95 MLAs, not a significant increase, right? So not that much more money. Worth it if you can make every person's vote count, right? Second part of that question was.
We're just talking about the time. The one thing that I kept reading a lot of, again, from the no side, was that
governments.
The government can take a long time to put the government into its place.
They love to use Italy as an example, and Sweden as an example right now, and Netherlands. Well, those are all 9 out of the 10 OECD countries with the top economies use proportional representation, right? In terms of factors of livability, economic prosperity, happiness, proportional representation, countries that use proportional representation usually top that, right? We fall far below. In terms of governance, the longest and most comprehensive study ever done was done by a political scientist, Dr. Aaron Lippert. He studied 36 countries over 50 years, countries with different varying electoral system. Found really no difference in terms of the number of elections and the number of days that the governments were formed or not formed between countries that had first past the post and countries that had proportional representation. The no side likes to come to that a lot. I think, what was it, in a 530-day period? I don't have those figures.
That's the figure around the 500, yeah.
530-day, well, in a 530-day period, I think the BC Liberals in 2 or 3 years ago sat 30 days out of that 530-day period. So BC was still governed at that point.
Sure.
So I think that you can take out instances here and there, but if you look at statistics and if you look at that study over a 50-year, over an impressively long period, over 36 different countries, it doesn't pan out. Statistics say that countries with proportional representation are no more unstable than countries with first past the post.
Well, and another question, again, we've been asking pretty much the same questions throughout the day. One of the things that I've asked everybody here today is how do you react and how do you deal? And I don't use the word spin by any means, but how do you get it out there to the people if the numbers are low? Because this really is an important vote. And every country deals with voter apathy sometimes, and especially with this, where one of the questions was, it's not decided by 50% plus one of the number of BC voters, but will be decided by 50% plus one of the ballots returned. Is that true?
Absolutely true, and that's how we decide elections.
Yeah.
That's how we decide elections. It's not 100% of the people don't come out to vote. It's fairly low.
Yeah.
And that is, so right now, if you have a government that's elected to 100% of the power with only 40% of the vote, well, it's not 40% of the vote electorate. It's something like 17 to 20% of people that have voted to put that government in power. No different from our election system right now. But at least staying with the same old system won't do anything. This is trying to address that. This is trying to address voter apathy. Yeah. Again, proportional representation, countries that have proportional representation, an average when they move over, they get a 7% higher average voter turnout than countries with first past the post. And very important, every country that had first past the post system and moved to a proportional representation system, none of them have moved back. Mm-hmm. We have that built in here.
I mean, that was my next question.
We have that built in here.
You've obviously done your research and you have the history with this. Was the publics in some of these other countries, citizens, were they apprehensive? I mean, was there the same amount of confusion?
Absolutely.
And
same
now
arguments.
they look back and no one wants
Absolutely.
to. Okay.
New Zealand, go back. Everybody's got Google. Go back to, I think it was the 90s when New Zealand did this, and you will see the same arguments. You will see absolutely the same arguments. It's confusing. It's difficult. It's, the extremists will rule. The people don't know what they're doing. You're going to lose your local representation. Same arguments were used. They've been using it for quite some time now, and they're very happy with it.
One of the comments that the Liberals mentioned today was more about, well, the NDPs are doing this to placate the Green Party. Yeah. Answer that if you could.
False, absolutely. It was in the platform, and you can go back to our platform. It was in the platform. There will be a referendum on proportional representation. They've, within the 16 or 17 months they've been in government, they've fulfilled about 70% or 80% of the promises that were in their platform. This is a government that's, when it writes something down in their platform, will follow through and do it.
Can you talk a little bit about we talked to the folks from the Green Party, our last segment. Can you talk a bit about how the process went in putting this all together? How many people were consulted? Was every party consulted when you were putting this together?
There was a rigorous debate in this in legislature, and I think that's one of the reasons why you'll see the options that are there. Yeah. You'll see the actual options, because that was specifically to address that concern of, well, we don't want to just vote yes and no. We don't know who's going to make the decision afterwards. Well, here we're actually going to let the people decide. In terms of numbers, my apologies, I'm not privy to those numbers because I'm not, I wasn't part of those discussions.
Sure.
But you'll see that the referendum is designed to answer those questions and to answer those concerns that the other parties, that other people had, and to leave as much of it to the public as we can.
We've boy, time flies. We got a few days left, kind of thing. Can you
Absolutely.
talk about what your party will be doing over these final 7, 8, 10 days?
Well, again, we're going out, to every door that we can, talking to people. There's events happening over the next little while, and I think at every event we'll be passing out informational leaflets, trying to get people out, trying to get people engaged in this process, right? I know I'll be doing that. I was out this weekend, knocking on the doors of Richmond, Queensborough. I was out the weekend before. I'll be doing it again this weekend. And I think that's what a lot of people are going to be doing.
Very nice. We're giving everybody a chance because it is complicated and because the debate, as I said earlier, it really didn't do it for me the other night. What's been great about today is we've had the time to sit like two guys over coffee or groups of people over coffee.
Perfect.
One thing I wanted everybody to do, though, is say, okay, look into whatever camera you want, and I guess that one right there. Give me a 30-second plug and a pitch to the viewer out there watching as to why they should vote yes.
It's a fairer system. It's a more democratic system. If you get 40% of the votes, you get 40% of the power, not 100% of the power, as has happened in the past here. It's a much fairer system, much more democratic system. 90 countries in the world use it. There's no reason we shouldn't be using it. Our first past the post system is antiquated. It's made for a different time period. Let's evolve and make democracy better. Make it so that every vote counts.
Well said. And you did it in 30 seconds. Well done. That's always good to see. We've been talking to Amandeep Singh, he NDP candidate in BC's 2017 election and a referendum spokesman. We should also say you grew up in Hong Kong, too. So
I did. Absolutely.
Very nice. Well, listen, we appreciate you taking time to see us today. We hope you're enjoying this discussion today on the Referendum 2018. It's sponsored by the Richmond Sentinel. Hey, if you have any questions, please go to elections.bc.ca or 1-800-661-8683. Speaking of questions, we have another one right now.
I guess at this point in time, it's all about questions. I did watch the debate the other day that they had on television. It left me with more questions likely than answers, but I'm certainly going to follow the process through, and at the appropriate time, at the end of the month, I'll go cast my ballot.
Excellent. And last question is, do you have any concerns about this referendum?
I don't think so. I think the political system has been looking for answers for some time. I don't know if this is the right answer or not, but I'm certainly open-minded as to let's try something different or better for the future if it might work.
Here is Martin Van den Hemel, who is back, the editor of the Richmond Sentinel, our sponsors today. And okay, there's 3 out of the 3 done. Your thoughts?
I'm a better man now.
You let these people talk, you're going to learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
Wow. And definitely hearing the perspectives from the Liberals, the NDP, and the Green, I feel I know more about this topic, and voting will be definitely something that's on the top of my mind for the next few days, for sure.
Very nice. I want you to talk a little bit more because we're so grateful, the Richmond Sentinel, of which you are the editor, put this on today because it is important. As I said earlier, I think far too many times we get these little 2-minute sound bites or 22 minutes the other night at the debate, and it's just not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. A few weeks ago, we were fortunate enough to take part in a similar type of thing with the civic candidates, and I think I mentioned to you then, when people complain about something, the first thing I ask them when they call the newspaper is, did you vote?
Yeah.
If you don't like the current system, are you going to participate? Are you going to have an informed vote? Are you going to make an informed decision? And absolutely, with this event today, for the last 3 hours, we've had a chance to hear the insight of these 3 groups.
Yeah, and again, as you've been saying throughout the day, if people are just joining us or caught the tail end of it, where can they see all of this again?
Well, if you've missed it, the first hour we had the Liberal Party in here. That's available on the Richmond Sentinel's YouTube channel, and you'll also find it on Facebook as well.
And and people can see it throughout the day, and tomorrow will be up there for a while. Yeah?
Absolutely,
okay.
Yeah. So if you're unsure about something and you want to hear what the parties have to say, absolutely check us out.
Well, listen, it has been an insightful day, as you said. Lots to take in. There's been a lot unpacked here today, but I'm glad we got to do this. I'm glad we had the time. So thanks again to the Richmond Sentinel. Thanks to Paul as well. He's the guy that puts this all together, and we want to thank Florence Gordon. And I can't do this without the guys from Hubcast Media. So we got a bunch of them here. Mike, who is gone but was here. Peter's here. Delan's here. And Adam, thank you back in the studio because it's all about you guys. It's Hubcast Media who always are here to help us with this. And again, a reminder, it's elections.bc. .ca/referendum. And do not forget 1-800-661-8683. We should mention, and I've been neglecting to do this today, but we need to mention this just for the record, that we did invite the leader of the Liberal Party, Andrew Wilkinson. He was here, of course, but the Green Party, Andrew Weaver was invited. NDP leader, John Horgan, was invited. They could not make it, but of course they did send very good representatives to plead the case on their behalf. Okay, we're here at Quilchena Golf and Country Club here in Richmond, BC. Thank you for joining us. And once again, you can find all this on the Richmond Sentinel YouTube page, and on
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for tuning in, and please do vote. It is your future.